Day 92, I'm reading If God is Love, page 158. A Gracious Lifestyle. At the turn of the 20th century, long before Christians began to wear bracelets with the letters, "What would Jesus do?" Charles Sheldon wrote a provocative novel entitled In His Steps. The premise of his book was a group of Christians decided to ask the question, what would Jesus do, prior to making a decision or taking an action. Though the answers reflect the sensibilities of that time and the prejudices of the writer, the book suggested Jesus was far more than a sacrificial lamb. Sheldon thought Christians should imitate Jesus. But which Jesus? The portrayal of Jesus in the Gospel is uneven, with variations in the story, with some incidents that seem more credible than others, and with the theological agendas of the authors influencing what Jesus say and does. Every attempt to reclaim the historical Jesus can be accused of manipulating Jesus. Mel Gibson's movie The Passion of the Christ, though it presented itself as a historic recreation, probably told us more about Mel Gibson than it did about Jesus. How do we escape the accusation, often valid, that Jesus ends up looking remarkably like us? One solution is to acknowledge Jesus was like many of us. One solution is to acknowledge Jesus was like many of us. He struggled to know and understand God. He questioned and challenged many assumptions. He learned through trial and error. He developed over time a set of core principles that emphasized the relationship over religious conformity. In doing so, Jesus became an example of the struggle and process rather than the answer to every question. What would Jesus do in a given circumstance? I don't know, but he seemed to always seek the gracious way. This was no easier for him than it is for us. He wasn't always able to practice what he preached. The inconsistencies in Jesus' life aren't a reason to ignore him, but encouragement for taking him seriously. Having said that, I need to begin with a story I question. According to the Bible, there was one group of people with whom Jesus was not gracious. He ate with sinners, touched lepers, honored Romans, and recognized Samaritans. But Jesus is portrayed as being hateful towards Pharisees. Matthew 23 contains a long litany of accusations and denunciations in which Jesus repeatedly insults and curses this group of people. Now it could be that Jesus did rail at the Pharisees. Even though he'd taught his disciples to love their enemies, he may have come to the end of his rope. I've not always responded graciously to my critics. On many occasions, I've said things that contradicted my theology and demonstrated how much more I have to learn about grace. Perhaps Jesus had a bad day. But far more likely, this passage of Scripture represents how quickly the church abandoned the principles of Jesus and began to portray the Pharisees, who were the other major Reformation movement within Judaism, as hypocrites. The church made them enemies of Jesus and put its curses in Jesus' mouth. There is considerable historic and literary evidence of this pattern in the early church. But even that isn't my primary reason for suspecting Jesus never attacked the Pharisees. I don't think Jesus acted this way towards his opponents because he taught me not to act that way toward mine. Many times I've been tempted to apply the condemnations of the Matthew 23rd to my critics, to call them hypocrites, blind fools, and whitewashed tombs, to defend God's grace with words of wrath. It simply doesn't work. In doing so, I become the hypocrite. How we treat our critics is the clearest indication of our theology. Fortunately, not all of Jesus' words for his opponents were caustic. He said, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing." These are gentle, humble, open, and compassionate words. Let me share 4 stories that incarnate a gracious lifestyle of gentleness, humility, openness, and compassion. One day, Jesus was resting by a well when a woman approached. That she was alone and drawing water in the middle of the day was telling. The other woman of her village had apparently shunned her. When Jesus asked her for a drink, she asked, "How it is that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria?" She was surprised Jesus even acknowledged her. Jesus accepted her as she was. He didn't treat her with the hostility she expected. He listened to her story, a long litany of failed relationship. Rather than condemning her, he spoke of the meaning of life and of God without using complicated theological language or arguments, without judging her behavior or her beliefs. Rather than demanding she adopt Orthodox Judaism, he said, "God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." Jesus was gentle, reading between the lines and responding to her need. Imitating him, gracious Christianity listens to where people are instead of telling them where they should be. I learned this lesson from one of my most ardent opponents. I mentioned earlier in the book that one of my critics wrote a letter suggesting I be horsewhipping, though he later apologized. Let me tell you about his apology. One Sunday morning, he showed up at my church with a bag of rocks. That Sunday, I happened to be out of town. It's probably just as well. If I'd seen him carrying those rocks in the front, I had been sneaking out of the back. My congregation, who knew his animosity, was nervous when, at the end of the service, he rose and walked to the front of the meeting room. A couple of people ducked out, fearing the worst. Instead, this man laid his rocks on the altar and said, "Forgive me, I won't be throwing rocks at your pastor anymore." So let's keep reading. Though he and I still don't agree on many things, we agree Jesus has condemned us to love one another. Though he remains unconvinced of the power of grace to save all, he demonstrated how grace had changed him. His grace also changed me, for what he didn't know is that I'd been throwing rocks as well. When he dropped his, I was able to drop mine. His gentleness, where there should have been hostility, allowed us to hear one another again. Okay, I'll stop here. Thanks so much. Please correct him if you can. Bye.